Hey, Aaron Rabinowitz here for RedGiantTV.com. In this episode of Red Giant TV, Michael Park, who leads the Trapcode forum at Creative Cow, will be showing us how to create a Death Eater Apparition Effect. Apparition. You know what I mean. It's that thing that those bad guys in Harry Potter do when they appear with the smoke and the masks. Oy vey, mister, we got some trouble. No idea where that came from. Anyway, I'll leave it at that, and I'll let Mike do the talking, as he has a lot to say on the subject of Trapcode particular. Oh, you'll see. So get your wands out and prepare to say Expelliarmus. Take it away, Mike.
Hey everyone, Michael Park here, and in this project we're going to create a cool smoky apparition effect. Now this is usually the part of the tutorial where Aaron says something clever or witty or cool, and since I've never been accused of being any of those things, let's pretend I said something interesting and skip ahead to the project. Now we've got a lot to accomplish today, so grab yourself a cool beverage, let's fire up After Effects and get started. The first thing we need to do is import our footage, so in the project window, double-click and navigate over to the project folder. Now I've provided two separate pieces of footage. One is the Alley JPEG and the other is the Robed Woman movie. Now the Robed Woman movie comes from the Crowd Control collection at www.allbetsareoff.com. The one I'm using is a full-size version, which is 1280 by 720, but the one I provided for you in the project file is a watermarked smaller version at 640 by 360. If you'd like the full-size version, go to allbetsareoff.com and purchase the full-size version. Select both of the footage items and click Open. Let's create a new composition by selecting Composition, New Composition. Let's name this composition BG for background. I'm going to use the HDV 720p 25 frames per second preset and have a duration of 6 seconds long. Let's click OK. To this composition, let's drop in the Alley JPEG. Now I want to move this image around a little bit so that the center of the alley is centered up in our composition. So, hit P to reveal the position of the alley, and let's just move this over a little bit until we have a position of 608 by 188. The overall color tone of this image is pretty warm, and we want to cool this down and make it look a lot more dreary, so let's do some color correction. With the layer selected, choose Effect, Color Correction, Curves. Let's go down to the red channel and decrease the red channel a bit. Next, let's do a little more color correction by choosing Effect, Color Correction, CC Toner, and let's select the mid-tone here and change it from this kind of a taupey color to a mid-blue with an RGB value of 39, 42, 52. Now this is pretty dark and I want to bring back some of that original color, so let's blend it with the original about 44%. Now I've got that nice, cold, dark look we're going for. We'll even add to this atmosphere a little more by doing some overall color correction later. Now that we have our background element done, let's move on to our character. Let's grab our Robed Woman movie and drop it into a new composition. If you scrub here through the timeline, you can see that our character picks up her head right around 6 seconds. You can also notice that her feet are pretty bright, and when we stick her in the alley, that's going to look out of place. We need to tone that down a bit. So, select the layer and hit Ctrl D to duplicate. Next, let's mask out her feet so that we can color correct that to match the rest of the scene. Let's solo this layer and zoom in a little bit. Select the pen tool and just do a rough mask around her feet. It doesn't have to be perfect because her feet really don't move much, and since the rest of her body is so dark anyway, you're not going to notice much difference. With the layer selected, hit F to reveal the mask feather properties, and let's feather this out 2 pixels. To this layer, let's add Effect, Color Correction, Exposure. And we're going to decrease this exposure from 0 to negative 4.4. That'll bring the color way down. Now if we unsolo the layer, you can see that it matches the rest of the character much better. And it's going to match our scene much better as well. The next thing I want to do is adjust the timing of this a little bit. Our particles are going to be coming down from 0 frames to about 1.5 seconds, and I want this character to start picking her head up at about 1.5 seconds. Right now, she doesn't start that until about 5 seconds. So let's select both these layers, scrub in the timeline to about 1.5 minutes, and just drag these down until she starts picking up her head. There, that looks pretty good. Next, just from a little housekeeping standpoint, since our other composition is 6 seconds long, let's shorten this to 6 seconds as well. Slide down in your timeline to 6 seconds, hit N to trim your work area bar, and then right-click and hit Trim Comp to Work Area. Next, let's create another new composition by choosing Composition, New Composition, and we'll call this Character Build. Let's keep the same settings and click OK. To this, let's add our background composition and also our Robed Woman composition. Let's hit S to reveal the scale of the Robed Woman and fit her into the scene a little bit better. I'm going to scale this down to about 70%. If you're using the project file, you're going to need to scale it up to 140%. The next thing we want to do is turn our background into a guide layer because we'll be using this as a pre-composition and we don't need this layer in this comp. So right click and choose guide layer. Now we'll be able to see it in this composition, but it won't show through into the next composition. Alright, now it's time to do a little color correction on our actress here. From the menu, choose Effect, Color Correction, Curves. And what we're going to do is bump up the green channel just a little bit so that she fits into the scene a little better. You can see her flesh tones are a little bright and a little warm for our scene. So let's go to the green channel and push this up just a little bit. Now she's a little over bright, so let's go back to the RGB channel and drop that just a bit. There, now she really fits into the scene. Now it's time to start building our particle effect, but before we do that, we need to create a custom layer source for it. So from the menu, choose Composition, New Composition, and let's call this Particle Source. Let's change the width to 300 and the height to 300 as well. The rest of the settings you can leave the same. To this composition, let's add a new solid layer by choosing Layer, New, Solid, or hitting Ctrl Y. Let's name this layer Fractal. Make sure it's comp size and the color doesn't matter, and click OK. To this solid layer, let's add Effect, Noise and Grain, Fractal Noise. If you're using CS4, you can also use the turbulent noise. It's about the same thing, but just renders a little bit faster. Now let's change a few of these settings around. Let's change the fractal type from Basic to Smeary, and change the noise type from soft linear to spline. Let's increase the contrast from 100 to 210, and let's increase the brightness from 0 to 87. Let's decrease the complexity from 6 to 1. Now I want this noise to evolve over time, so let's alt-click the evolution stopwatch and type time times 270. Now if you scrub through your timeline, you can see that our fractal noise evolves, but we have a lot of rough edges, so let's take care of that. With the layer selected, let's come up here to our mask and change to an ellipse tool. Double-click the ellipse tool and that will give us a circular mask. But still the edges are a little too harsh, so let's take care of that as well. With the layer still selected, choose Effect, Stylize, Roughen Edges. Let's increase the border from 8 to 250 and increase the scale from 100 to 440. This will really give us a nice rough look around the edges and really make this look much more organic. However, I want this to evolve over time as well, so let's once again alt-click the evolution stopwatch and type time times 270. Now if you scrub through the timeline, you can see the fractal noise evolving as well as the roughen edges evolving. The final effect we need to apply is a luma key. I want to key out everything that's dark, so from the menu choose Effect, Keying, Luma Key. Leave it on the default key out darker and increase the threshold from 0 to 52. This will give us some transparency in the middle, but it gives us a rather harsh edge. This isn't going to be a major problem since we're going to be using this as a source for particles, but I'd still like to smooth it out a bit. So let's increase the edge feather from 0 to 3. One last thing I want to do is have this whole composition rotate over time. So select the layer and hit R to reveal its rotation. Let's alt-click the stopwatch and type time times 360. Now the layer will rotate and evolve over time. Let's go back to our character build composition and select the new particle source pre-comp we just made and drop it into the timeline. Let's make it a 3D layer and hit W to give us our rotation tool. Now let's rotate it in the X to 90 degrees. Hit Shift to snap it. Let's hit V to bring up our move tool. Now we're going to set some position keyframes. So with the layer selected, hit P to reveal its position. Let's give ourselves a little more space because we're going to actually be going above our character here. Make sure you start on frame 0, and let's set a keyframe for the particle source position by left-clicking the stopwatch. Let's change the Y value from 360 to -178. This will put the layer above our character's head. Then move down to 11 frames and change the Y position to 570. This should put the layer right at our character's feet. We're also going to be changing the scale over time, so let's hit S to reveal the scale, go back to frame 0, and left-click the stopwatch to set a keyframe. Now the reason why we're going to change the scale of this layer is I want the particles it creates to start off a little thinner and then get wide at the base so it looks like the particles are ballooning out. So making sure you're on frame 0, let's change the scale from 100 to 20. Next, let's move down in the timeline to 12 frames and change the scale to 65%. Finally, move down to 1 second and change the scale up to 105%. Now as the particles are emitting at our character's feet, they'll actually balloon out and it'll look like a big column of smoke billowing from the feet. We're almost ready for our particles, but before we are, we need to add a couple lights to our scene to affect our particles. So from the menu, choose Layer, New, Light, and let's call this new light Left Light. Make sure it's a point light. Let's set the intensity to 120% and change the color to an RGB value of 177, 182, 182. Hit OK and then hit P to reveal its position. Let's change the X position to 486 and decrease the Y position to 194. Next, let's duplicate the layer by hitting Ctrl D and rename this right light. Hit P to reveal its position, and let's just change the X value from 486 to 768. Now that we have our light set up, we're ready for our particles. From the menu, choose Layer, New, Solid, and let's name this Smoke. Make sure it's comp size and the color doesn't matter. To this layer, let's add Effect, Trapcode, Particular. Let's twirl down the emitter settings and tell Particular that instead of a point emitter, we want to use a layer. Next, let's twirl down the layer emitter settings and tell Particular we want to use the particle source as our layer source. Let's change the layer sampling from current time to particle birth time and change the RGB usage to none. Next, let's decrease the velocity from 100 to 0, decrease the velocity random to 0 as well, and increase the velocity from motion from 20 to 50. This will allow the particles to inherit a lot of the velocity from the layer itself. Finally, I want to decrease the emitter size Z to 20 because I want the particles to emit kind of close to each other on the Z axis. Next, let's twirl down the particle settings and make a few more changes. I want to vary the life over time so that the particles will stay on when the trails come down, but that they'll dissipate once our character is revealed. So let's go down to the timeline to 20 frames, and let's set a keyframe by left-clicking the stopwatch. Let's hit U to reveal all the keyframes. Next, go down to a second 2 frames and decrease the life from 3 to 0.1. Now our particles will dissipate rather quickly at the end. Next, let's change the size from 5 to 3 to make the particles a bit smaller. Let's also twirl down the size over life, and this reveals a map that we can use to control the size of our particles during the lifespan. Now the way you adjust the map is you left click and drag in the window. And what I want to do is create kind of a curve so that the particles about midway through their life start slowly getting smaller, and then at the end they're about 25 to 30% of their initial size. So let's left click and drag from about the midpoint and create a nice smooth curve downward. It isn't imperative to get it exactly right or exactly smooth, but get it as close as you can. The next thing we want to do is to change the opacity over life as well. Once again, we have this curve, and this time we want these to go all the way down to 0 so that they'll fade out to 0 as their life comes to an end. Once again, let's go from about a third of the way through and make a nice curve downward. Next, let's change the color. By default, it's white, but we want to change it to an RGB value of kind of a dark gray. So let's choose 51 for the red, 48 for the green, and 48 for the blue. Now it's time to use one of the new features of Particular 2.0, and that's shading. Turn the shading to on, and what this does is it allows the particles to interact dynamically with lights that are created in your scene. This is a brand new feature, and it's pretty darn powerful. Now the nominal distance parameter will control how far away from the light that particles are affected. Let's increase this from 250 to 275. The ambient controls how much light is inherent on the particle. Let's decrease this from 20 to 0. And diffuse controls how much of the color of the particle shows. So let's increase this from 80 to 90. Let's turn shadowlet on for both main and auxiliary, and go down to the physics settings. I really want the particles to go upwards, so let's change the gravity from 0 to negative 500. If it were positive 500, the particles would be drawn downwards, but since it's negative, they'll actually go up. Let's twirl down the air settings and change a few more parameters. I want to give the particles a little bit of randomness as they're coming down, and the way we can do that is by increasing the spin. So let's increase the spin amplitude from 0 to 10, and let's decrease the fade-in time from 1 to 0. If we left that at 1, the spin would gradually fade in over 1 second, but since our animation is so short with the particles, I want them to spin from the outset. Let's also change the wind Y from 0 to negative 200. Just like the gravity, this will cause the particles to go upwards. Another setting we can use to create a little more turbulence or randomness in our particles is the turbulence field. So twirl that down and change the effect position from 0 to 50. I don't want a whole lot of change here, but just enough to give it a little bit of an uneven organic look. The final thing I want to adjust in the physics is the spherical field. Now, Particular has another physics setting, bounce, which allows you to set a floor layer for the particles to stop or interact with. Unfortunately, the air setting parameters don't have something like that. That's something I'd love to see in a future release. What we do have, though, is the ability to have the air particles interact with the spherical field. So we're going to actually use that to create a pseudo floor. The way I'm going to do this is to create a really big spherical field so that it's almost flat, and then when the particles come down, they'll hit that field and go outward, almost like they'd be hitting a floor. So let's go ahead and do that. In order to be able to see what we're doing, let's turn on the visualize fields. This will allow us to actually see the turbulent fields as well as our spherical field. If we increase the strength to 100, you can see we have a red circle in the middle, which represents how big our field is. Let's increase the radius from 100 to 2000. Now you can see that the entire screen is filled with our sphere. We need to move this down significantly. So let's grab the position Y and change that from 360 to 2550. You might be saying, where'd it go? Well, it's still there, it's just we have the feather turned way up. Let's turn the feathering down to 0, and you can see now that the field comes right to the feet of our character. Now we can turn off the visualize field so we don't get that in our render. We can also turn off our particle source here because we don't need to see that layer. Next, let's twirl down the auxiliary settings and let's change this from off to continuously. Now each one of our main particles will emit an auxiliary particle, or actually many auxiliary particles. Let's change a few of these settings. Let's increase the particles per second from 10 to 40, but decrease their life from 0.5 to 0.1. I want there to be a lot of particles emitted from the main particles, but I don't want them to be on very long. Let's change the size from 5 to 2.5 to make them a little bit smaller. Let's also increase the opacity to 100%, but twirl down the opacity over life and change some of these settings. Once again, we're going to want a nice smooth curve just like we did for our main particles. And you can go ahead and make yourself a curve, or you can simply go up here to our main particles and copy the one we already have by hitting copy, and then coming down to this dialog box and hitting paste. By default, auxiliary particles cycle through the rainbow. And as you twirl down the color over life, you can see that this dialog box controls that. Now sometimes this is handy because you want the particles to start out one color and die another color if you want to make, I don't know, smoke or trails or something like that. In our case, we want all the colors to be the same. So let's increase the color from main from 0 to 100. This way the auxiliary particles will have the same color as our main particles. Let's change the gravity from 0 to -100 and twirl down the control from main particles dialog box. Now I want our auxiliary particles to get some of our motion from the main particles, and the way to do that is to increase the inherent velocity. A setting of 50 will work nicely for us. We also want the wind to affect our auxiliary particles a little bit, so twirl down the physics panel and increase the wind effect position from 0 to 50%. Now we're going to use another new feature of Particular 2.0, and that's the World Transform dialog box. If we twirl this down, you can see we have 6 new parameters. Now in the past, in order to get the particles to spin around, you'd actually have to put a camera in your scene, link it to a null, and then rotate the camera around. This caused all kinds of havoc with other 3D layers in your scene. Fortunately, we don't have to do that anymore because we now have these new World Transform features. This will allow you to rotate the world in XYZ and actually offset the particles in XYZ space. We're going to be using the Y rotation. Let's alt-click the stopwatch and type time times 360. Now our particles will rotate around the y-axis as time goes by. This is why we wanted our particles to come straight down. If these were offset or coming at an angle, you'd get the particles to actually go around in a circle and it'd look kind of strange. Finally, let's go down to the rendering tab and turn on some motion blur. Let's change the motion blur from comp settings to on and increase the shutter angle from 360 to 540. Now that we have all these settings taken care of, the final thing we need to do with this particular layer is to keyframe the particles per second. So let's go back up to the emitter and let's twirl down on the timeline to 1 second 9 frames. We're really going to have a lot of particles coming down at first. So let's click the stopwatch and increase the particles per second from 100 to 30,000. Next, hit page down to go down 1 frame and decrease the particles per second from 30,000 down to 0. So we can keep this layer straight, let's rename this particular layer from Particular to Drop Particles. Alright, with our layer still selected, we're going to add another particular layer by choosing Effect, Trapcode, Particular. Now if you have Particular 1.5 or any preceding version of Particular, you're not able to do this. This is a brand new feature of Particular 2.0, and that's the ability to put multiple particular layers on the same solid. And I'll show you how to do that right now. If you twirl down the rendering settings, you can see there's a brand new setting called transfer mode. Now if you click the drop down box, you can see there are multiple modes that we can choose from. I'm going to use normal, but you could choose add, multiply screen, or anything that might fit your scene. Now you can see the initial drop particle layers behind the new layer we just created. Let's solo this so we can better see what we're talking about. Now I want these particles to start actually in the middle of the composition, so let's twirl down the emitter settings and let's keyframe the particles per second. Let's scrub down in the timeline to 1 second 2 frames. If your computer is lagging a bit, it's because you're trying to render out all these particles. What we can do is simply turn off this layer for now. Let's click the stopwatch to set a keyframe and change the particles per second from 100 down to 0. Now, between 0 frames and 1 second 2 frames, no particles will be emitted. Hit page down to go down 1 frame and increase the particles per second from 0 to 120,000. Finally, let's scrub down in our timeline to 2 seconds 10 frames and decrease the particles per second back down to 0. Next, let's change some of the emitter settings. Let's change the emitter type from point to layer, and once again we're going to use our drop source. So let's change the layer emitter from none to particle source. Also, let's change the current time to particle birth time and change the layer RGB usage to none. Let's change the direction from uniform to disk, and this will make the particles emit from the center in one plane. Turn the directional spread from 20 down to 0, and let's decrease the velocity as well from 100 to 20. Let's decrease the velocity random to 0 as well as the velocity from motion. Let's change the emitter size from 50 down to 1. We want these to all start from the ground plane. Next, go down to the particle settings and twirl those down. Let's change the life from 3 seconds to 0.8 so they don't stay on quite as long. We also want to decrease the size from 5 to 3. Once again, let's change the color to that dark gray color, which was an RGB value of 51, 48, 48. As we did before, let's twirl down the shading and turn it on. Increase the nominal distance back to 275. Let's decrease the ambient down to 0 and change the diffuse up to 90. Now we can match the other particles we have in our scene. Let's turn our shadowlets on and twirl down the physics setting. Let's change the gravity from 0 to -100 so particles will go up, just not as fast as our prior layer. Let's once again twirl down the air settings, and this time change the wind Y from 0 to -700. Twirl down the turbulence field, and we're going to increase the effect position from 0 to 115. This will make the particles kind of get a random motion as they go upwards. As we did with the spin layer before, let's change the fade-in time from 0.5 to 0.1. That way it'll start affecting the particles almost immediately. For this layer, we don't need any auxiliary particles, but we do need to twirl down the world transform. And once again, let's alt-click the stopwatch and type time times 360. Once again, let's twirl down our motion blur and turn it on, and change the shutter angle from 360 to 540 to match our other particles. Now let's turn our other particles back on, and you can see both of our particle systems visible. Now, looking at the bottom particle system, I think it's rotating a little bit too fast, and I want to change that down. So all we need to do is decrease the time times 360 to time times 180. Now it will only rotate half as fast. I think this will give us a better effect in the end. Now you're saying, okay, you got a lot of particles here, but it doesn't exactly look like smoke. Well, I think you're right, so let's go ahead and make it look a little more smoky. The first thing I want to do is add a directional blur to the layer to kind of make the particles blend in a little bit better. So, with the layer selected, choose Effect, Blur and Sharpen, Directional Blur. The direction is already set upwards, so that's good, but let's increase the blur length from 0 to 10. Now everything looks a little more wispy. But we're still not there yet. Let's add another one of my favorite effects, which is the CC Vector Blur effect by choosing Effect, Blur and Sharpen, CC Vector Blur. Let's increase the amount from 0 to 200, and increase the ridge smoothness from 1 to 10. Let's unsolo the layer to see it all in context. Everything's looking good so far, but the robed woman's feet are a little too low, so let's grab that composition, hit P to reveal its position, and let's increase it until the smoke covers up her feet. About 322 looks good. Now that we have our smoke taken care of, we want to animate our character so that she is revealed as the smoke comes up. To do that, we're going to add a linear wipe. So, with the woman layer selected, choose Effect, Transition, Linear Wipe. Let's change the wipe angle from 90 to 180, and scrub down in the timeline to 1 second 12 frames. Let's set a keyframe for the transition completion, and increase that to 100% so that she vanishes. Next, let's scrub down in the timeline to 2 seconds 6 frames, and change the transition completion to 0. She animates on just fine, but it's a little bit of a harsh edge, so let's increase the feather significantly from 0 to 60. Now as the particles animate on and go up, she's revealed nicely. We're almost there. Let's create a new composition by choosing Composition, New Composition, and let's make this the HDV 720p preset, and let's call this Mid Comp. Let's choose OK. To this composition, let's add our character build comp, as well as our background comp. Now, since we had our background comp set as a guide layer and our character build comp, you can't see it here, and that's why you set it as a guide layer. The reason why I did that is I want to add a shadow to this entire layer, and I wanted both the particles as well as the character to have a shadow in the final composition. If I had put the background layer, the character, and the smoke in the same composition, I would have had to build 2 shadow effects instead of 1, and it wouldn't have looked quite as nice. Speaking of shadows, let's go ahead and add one. Select the character build layer and choose Effect, Red Giant Warp, Red Giant Shadow. Now what this is a plugin that'll help you create shadows in your compositions. And this is a great plugin because instead of having to duplicate your layer and then turning everything black and then making it 3D and putting it, in the right perspective and everything else, you can take care of that all in one step. Now the way the interface is designed, you take these 3 handles and move them in space to line up your shadow. Take the first 2, the bottom 2, and line them up at the base of the object you want to create a shadow. The third one will control the angle and the distance of your shadow. In our case, we want it to go a little off here to the left so that we can see it behind and into the distance a little bit. There, that looks good. Let's also come up here to the shadow and change a couple of the settings. Scroll down to the shadow look and let's increase the softness from 0 to about 30. This will make it blend a little bit better into our scene and not give us such a harsh edge. If you can't really see this really well, there's a neat little feature here on your window that I'm not sure if you know about. It's the Adjust Exposure. You can pull this up a little bit to maybe +2. Now you can see you can adjust your shadow a little easier because it's a little bit brighter. You can also see that you have a hard edge here from where the top of this composition is. You can get rid of that a little bit by adjusting the fade length. I'm going to adjust the fade start to about 60, which will make it a lot darker here, and I'm going to adjust the fade length down to about 15. That'll give us a nice soft edge. Next, let's put this back where we want it. That looks pretty good, and we can adjust the exposure back down. Now that we have everything set up, we need to do some overall color correction, so let's add a new adjustment layer by choosing Layer, New, Adjustment Layer. This will color correct everything at once. Now let's use another Red Giant plugin, Magic Bullet Looks. So, from the menu, choose Effect, Magic Bullet Looks. When you click Edit, you'll open up a brand new dialog box where we can make some changes. Now that we're inside the Looks Builder, you can see on the left-hand side you have the Looks tab, and these are basic presets that you can use to put onto your composition to create some very common looks. As you can see, you have a wide variety of presets to choose from. In our case, I'm going to come down here to the music videos and choose the Berlin preset as a starting point. The setting that I really want to adjust here is the curve. So left-click the curves to reveal the dialog box, and let's adjust the curve. Let's adjust up the darks just a little bit and brighten it up just a hair as well. Let's click OK to accept these settings and head back to After Effects. Back in After Effects, you can see that Magic Bullet Looks has done a great job of tinting and darkening our scene, but I think it's a little too dark. We need to back that off a little bit, and the way I'm going to do that is by using some more color correction. So to the adjustment layer, let's choose Effect, Color Correction, Levels. You can see that all of our color is really smashed down here at the dark end. Let's change our input white and drag that down to about 115 or so to bring back some of the brightness. Now that we have the proper levels, I think we got a little too much blue in the scene, so let's take care of that. From the menu, choose Effect, Color Correction, Hue and Saturation. In the Master Saturation channel, let's decrease the saturation to -40. That'll bring everything down a little bit, but I also want to change a little bit of the cyan. So let's come to the Color channel and change it to the cyans and decrease that by 15. There, everything looks like it's in the right color zone, but it's still a little dark. So let's go ahead and bump it up by using a Curves adjustment. Choose Effect, Color Correction, Curves. And in the RGB channel, let's just bump it up a little bit. There still seems to be a little too much blue, so let's go to the Blue channel and decrease that. Alright, we got our scene set up, but now I think we need to add a little bit of camera movement. Let's go back to our project and grab the mid comp and drop it into a new composition. Let's rename this Final Comp. I want to add a little bit of a vignette, so let's do that with an adjustment layer. Choose Layer, New, Adjustment Layer, and let's grab the elliptical tool, make sure you're in the center, and left click and hold and drag out while hitting the Control and Shift keys together. This way you'll drag out a perfect circle centered in the middle of your composition. We're going to do it right about there. Next, change the masks from add to subtract and hit F to reveal the feather. Let's feather the mask out 150 pixels and then drop down the mask settings and decrease the expansion to -150. To this layer, let's add Effect, Color Correction, Exposure. Let's decrease the exposure from 0 to -1.5. This will darken the outsides and feather that darkness in towards the middle. Now we can add our camera move. We don't really need to set up a new camera in the scene since this is all one big flat layer. We can do this simply with a scale. So let's grab our mid comp and hit S to reveal its scale. Making sure you're on frame 0, left click to set a keyframe, and then scrub down to 6 seconds. Let's increase the scale from 100 to about 115%. Now since we zoomed in and our character is a little higher than center, I think we need to adjust the position down a little bit. So let's hit P to reveal its position. Once again, come back to frame 0 and set a keyframe. Then move to 6 seconds, and let's drag this down in the Y just a little bit so that our character stays in the middle. After a quick RAM preview, you can see we have a great effect here with our character appearing out of the smoke. One other thing you might want to do is easy ease our camera move if you don't like the linear look. Simply select both keyframes, hit F9, or you can right-click, choose Keyframe Assistant Easy Ease. As a final note, while we've used black smoke here, you can really make that any color you want. Simply play around with the smoke color as well as the light colors and positions. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and learned a little bit more about Particular 2.0, Magic Bullet looks, and Magic Bullet Warp. Until next time, this is Michael Park.
Thanks, Mike. I feel as if my brain is now oddly full, but hey, there's always room for more, and if you want more magical and science fictional effects up your wizarding sleeve, you should check out Mike's soon-to-be-released Creative Cow Master Series training DVD, Practical Particles, which focuses on the use of particular in visual effects and motion graphics. There are a lot of cool projects covered on the DVD. You got a little Harry Potter action, some Star Trek, Armageddon with the beaming and the magic and the explosions, oy vey! Some other cool stuff too. You'll be able to find that DVD at training.creativecow.net. And you can find our host, the esteemed Mr. Park, over at creativecow.net, moderating the Trapcode Forum. And of course, if you want to try any of the Red Giant plugins that Michael used in this tutorial, you can download a free trial at redgiantsoftware.com. Once again, I'm Aaron Rabinowitz for RedGiantTV.com. See you next time.